in 2004 and 2005. And I'd gone back to seminary, so I was just a little older than the other fellows, most of them. So I was younger than some, older than some. But I had been in ministry a few years, and a lot of the young guys in seminary were writing about Calvinism. They were talking about the doctrine of Calvinism, and they were, writing about the problems with the doctrine of Calvinism, and in like several classes. And so I phoned home. I called Pastor McClure, and I said, Dr. McClure, I said, what is the deal with Calvinism right now? Is there a resurgence in it? And he said, well, come to think of it. And he just mentioned, if you take the majority speakers on the radio, people that are preaching on the radio, and I'm talking conservative stations. We have the music on our local radio station, the conservative one's pretty conservative, but the preaching is not. And I'm talking about BBN. And you would take, depends on the week. Sometimes they'll have a week of this preacher, and sometimes they'll have a real good preacher that isn't into the doctrine of Calvinism. But generally speaking, their evangelical preachers are Calvinist, generally speaking. And when they talk about grace, and when the Bible talks about grace, they're not talking about the same thing. I learned when I was a child that grace is God's riches at Christ's expense. You ever heard that acronym used? God's riches at Christ's expense. On a test in high school, I had to fill out a definition for grace, and it was 2 words: unmerited favor, undeserved favor. In other words, grace is getting something that you do not deserve. I remember in high school, I preached in preaching contests and things like that. And I preached a sermon once on faith, and I preached a sermon once on grace. And when I studied and I looked up the simple definition for grace, grace was not God sovereignly chooses people to go to heaven and people to go to hell before they were ever born. But today, that's grace. Today, when you talk, it's true, isn't it, Charlie? Today, when you hear somebody talking about the doctrines of grace, what they mean is God hates people before they're ever born, condemns them to hell, and it's okay because He's good because He's God. And that's the doctrines of grace. So you ought to know Galatians, because Galatians talks all about grace. Talks all about justification, and as simple as it seems, sometimes you're talking to somebody and you're not talking about the same thing. And grace is one of those words.